In New Orleans, between 1820 and 1845, midwives began whispering about cribs that should not exist. Cribs holding babies born to enslaved women, yet pale as milk, with eyes too light for candlelight to explain. Infants whose skin did not darken with days or weeks. Infants whose cries were softer, almost restrained, as if the world already knew they did not belong where they were born. The records do not call them miracles. They call them inventory anomalies. Plantation ledgers marked with thin red ink. Church baptism books with entire lines scratched out. Birth records that ended mid-sentence, as if the pen itself refused to continue. Within days of their birth, these children vanished. Not stolen, not lost, reclassified, sold, quietly, into white families who had been waiting. The enslaved mothers were told the infants had died, or taken for protection, or transferred to distant parishes. Some were forced to sign marks they could not read. Others were beaten until silence replaced grief. By 1831, the city's orphan registries showed an impossible pattern, an increase in white infants with no documented mothers, arriving in private placements through church intermediaries. And always, the same phrase appeared in coded margins. Fit for passing. This is not a story about genetics. This is a story about erasure. About a city that learned how to bleach bloodlines without leaving a stain. About a system so practiced at control that it could transform human beings into lies and sell them as truth. And once you see how it worked, you will never unsee the white cribs again. The mothers were not permitted to grieve. In the slave quarters outside New Orleans, women learned quickly that memory itself could be punished. A woman who asked questions about her child was labeled unstable. A woman who cried too loudly was separated from her remaining children. Silence became survival. Yet memory does not die easily. Some women reported dreams in which their babies stood on the other side of locked church doors, dressed in white linen, staring back at them without recognition. Others said they felt their milk never dry, as if their bodies knew a child still lived somewhere. Plantation owners called it hysteria. Church officials called it God's will. But private correspondence between clergy tells another story. Letters reveal arrangements with ethical families, payments disguised as donations, and urgent requests to remove the infant before features become difficult to explain. Timing mattered. Skin tone changed slowly. Identity, once fixed, could not. One enslaved woman, known only as Esther in a surviving ledger, refused to accept her child's disappearance. She memorized the sound of his breathing, the small crescent scar behind his ear. Years later, while scrubbing floors in the French Quarter, she saw a boy exiting a carriage. Pale, well-dressed, with the same scar. She collapsed. The boy did not recognize her. That night, Esther was sold south. Her name disappears from all records the following month. These women were not just robbed of children. They were robbed of proof that the children ever existed. And the city learned something essential. If you control records, witnesses, and language, you can make even motherhood disappear. The church stood at the center of it all, not as a sanctuary, but as a filter. Baptismal records in New Orleans from this period contain gaps that historians long attributed to fire or flooding. But when those records are layered against plantation birth logs, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Children entered the church as enslaved. They exited as white. Priests did not call it deception. They called it redemption through reassignment. A baby baptized under one name could be rebaptized weeks later under another, especially if no enslaved witnesses were present. The original entry would be altered, ink scraped thin, margins smoothed with fingertips. Some pages bear faint shadows where names once lived. The justification was chillingly simple. These children, one cleric wrote, are unburdened by the visible mark of servitude. To return them would be to condemn them unnecessarily. No mention of mothers. No mention of consent. Only efficiency. Orphanages operated as temporary holding chambers, quiet places where infants were assessed for viability. Eye color, hair texture, bone structure. The language mirrors livestock evaluation, stripped of tenderness. Children who could pass were moved quickly. Those who could not were returned to bondage. Or worse. By the 1840s, the system had become self-sustaining. Wealthy families trusted the church trusted the ledgers, and the ledgers trusted silence. What disappeared was not only truth, it was accountability. Some of the children grew up knowing. not consciously, but instinctively. White-passing children adopted through church placements often reported the same sensations, recurring nightmares of chains they had never seen, unexplained fear of auction squares, a deep panic when hearing certain hymns sung too slowly. Families dismissed it as imagination. Doctors called it inherited nerves. But journals tell another story. One young woman, raised as the daughter of a prominent New Orleans merchant, wrote of dreams where a woman with her same eyes stood behind her reflection, mouthing words she could not hear. Another man described feeling physically ill whenever he passed a particular plantation, later discovered to be the place of his birth. They did not know why they felt divided. They only knew they were split. Some discovered fragments of truth through accidental slips, an old priest refusing to meet their gaze, a midwife who crossed herself too quickly, a document that did not align. Others never learned. But the body remembers what the mind is denied. By the 1850s, several such individuals vanished from records entirely. Some left the city. Some died young. Some were institutionalized after insisting their names were wrong. The horror was not just what was done to them. It was that the lie required them to live it every day. By the time the practice was questioned, it was too late. The system had become profitable. Churches received donations. Families received heirs. Plantation owners erased complications. And the city gained a reputation for discretion. No single villain existed. Only roles. Midwives who looked away. Clerks who adjusted ink. Priests who rationalized. Buyers who never asked. The most terrifying part? No one believed they were evil. They believed they were correcting a mistake of birth. But systems built on erasure always expand. By 1860, whispers surfaced of adults being reassigned, not just infants. People with ambiguous features offered freedom in exchange for silence. Identity became a negotiable asset. When the Civil War approached, records vanished faster. Fires consumed archives conveniently. Entire orphanage wings were emptied overnight. After emancipation, some mothers searched. They found nothing, because the truth had already been sold, baptized, renamed, and seated at dinner tables that would never make room for it. And New Orleans learned its final lesson. If you erase the past thoroughly enough, the future will inherit the lie as fact. Beneath certain orphanages in New Orleans existed rooms that never appeared on blueprints. They were not cells. They were not nurseries. They were holding spaces, cool, quiet chambers where infants waited while decisions were made about their futures. Candles burned low to keep skin from darkening too quickly. Windows were covered with linen soaked in lime to soften the sun. Caretakers referred to these rooms as the vaults. Here, children were measured against a silent standard. Hair texture examined under wet cloth. Bone structure compared to illustrated charts imported from Europe. Names were not spoken, only numbers. If a child failed to meet expectations, the decision was swift. If a child passed, a letter was written. Families from as far as Charleston and Philadelphia traveled quietly to New Orleans, not through public channels, but through parish back doors. They did not come to adopt. They came to receive. The vaults created a pause between truth and reinvention, a moment where identity was still fluid, still unclaimed. Surviving notes from caretakers describe an unsettling pattern. Infants who cried less once separated from enslaved mothers. Interpreted as calm, later understood as shock. No screaming meant compliance. The vaults were eventually sealed, not out of shame, but because they were no longer necessary. The process had been perfected. By the time inspectors arrived decades later, they found nothing but dust and empty cradles. And yet, some walls bore faint scratches at adult height, as if someone returned. To maintain the illusion, families required paperwork. And New Orleans became a pioneer in something far more dangerous than forgery. Manufactured ancestry. Genealogists connected to the church produced entire family trees overnight. Grandparents invented. Birthplaces reassigned. Dates adjusted just enough to avoid scrutiny. Medical journals of the era helped justify it. Doctors claimed environment could lighten features. That moral upbringing could influence complexion. That race itself was unstable, so long as power controlled the definition. Children grew up surrounded by portraits that did not resemble them. When questions arose, answers arrived swiftly. You take after an aunt. She was fair like that. Don't dwell on it. Doubt became disobedience. One ledger shows payments for lineage correction, bundled with donations to seminaries. Truth had a price. Silence had a discount. What made the system nearly invincible was not force, but comfort. Those who benefited preferred not to know. Those who suspected were given incentives to forget. And those who remembered were erased. By the late 1850s, New Orleans had perfected a method of turning living people into acceptable myths. Every system cracks eventually. In 1857, a junior priest assigned to archival maintenance discovered a baptism book that did not match its index. Names crossed out. Dates overwritten. Margins too clean. He began copying entries by hand. What he found was not chaos, but design. Children entered under enslaved mothers' names. Days later, identical birth details reappeared under white family names. Same time, same weight, same scar notations. The priest confronted his superior. He was told to pray harder. When he refused, he was transferred to a rural parish and instructed never to speak of what he had seen. But before leaving, he hid a copy of the altered pages inside a hollowed theology volume. That book survived. It resurfaced decades later in a private collection, its pages brittle, its handwriting steady, its implications devastating. The file never reached courts. It reached whispers, and whispers, once released, could not be recalled. When slavery ended, the lie did not. Freed women searched orphanages, churches, and courthouses for children long declared dead. They carried scars, memories, and names no record would confirm. Officials expressed sympathy and closed doors. Many of the white passing children were adults now, married, educated, protected by families who had no intention of reopening the past. Some mothers recognized them anyway. A familiar walk, a tilt of the head, the same hands. Approaching meant danger. To claim the truth was to accuse the church, the city, and the law itself. So most walked away, and New Orleans continued forward, built on an absence no monument acknowledged. The true horror is not that this happened. It is that it worked. The system required no monsters. Only people willing to believe paperwork over pain, records over reality. Some descendants still feel it today, a sense of dislocation. A history that refuses to align. DNA tests that raise questions no elder can answer. Because somewhere in New Orleans, a ledger once decided who could belong. And once a child is sold as truth, the lie never truly dies. Between 1866 and 1872, fires swept through New Orleans with unsettling precision. They did not consume entire blocks. They did not rage out of control. They targeted rooms, archive wings, record closets, basement storage beneath churches and orphanages. Flames that burned hot enough to destroy paper, but spared stone, pews, and altars. Official reports blamed faulty lamps, careless clerks, post-war neglect. But survivors noticed something else. The fires always began after inquiries. After a freed woman demanded access to baptismal books. After a journalist requested orphan transfer logs. After a genealogist asked why certain surnames appeared too suddenly in prominent families. The fires erased questions before they could be asked twice. In one incident, an entire parish archive burned overnight, except for donation records stored in a separate iron cabinet. Money survived. Names did not. The city mourned the loss of history. Privately, institutions breathed easier. Because the past, once ash, cannot testify. Not all of them stayed away. Some returned. White passing adults, drawn back to New Orleans by something they could not name. A pull toward neighborhoods they had never lived in. Churches that made their chest tighten. Streets where grief felt rehearsed. They searched for answers under the guise of curiosity. They found resistance. Clerks misplaced files. Priests insisted records were destroyed. Elders smiled too tightly and suggested genealogy was unhealthy. A few pressed harder. Those individuals often vanished from polite society. Careers stalled. Reputations softened with rumors of instability. Some were committed to asylums after insisting they were born wrong. Their claims were dismissed as obsession. But journals recovered later describe a common realization. I am living someone else's forgiveness. They understood that their comfort was purchased by another's silence. And once you know that, you cannot unknow it. By the late 19th century, New Orleans had developed an unspoken law. Do not disturb settled identities. It applied across race, class, and church. Those who passed benefited from protection. Those who remembered were told remembering was dangerous. And those who questioned were reminded, gently, that the city thrived on discretion. This rule outlived slavery. It shaped housing, education, marriage, politics. It taught generations that truth was negotiable, but stability was sacred. The horror was no longer hidden. It was normalized. Over time, the story softened. People spoke vaguely of complex lineages, of Creole mystery, of a city where bloodlines blurred naturally. It sounded poetic. It was strategic. By turning exploitation into folklore, responsibility dissolved. No perpetrators, no victims, just romance and ambiguity. But myths are only lies that survived long enough to be admired. And beneath the charm, the structure remained intact. What never appeared in any ledger were the costs. The mothers who died believing their children were buried. The children who sensed an absence they could never name. The descendants who feel disoriented by histories that refuse to align. No document measures that loss. No fire can erase it. Because trauma, once institutionalized, does not stay in the past. It learns how to hide. In 1911, during renovations of a closed seminary outside New Orleans, workers discovered a sealed wall cavity. Inside it, a rusted tin box. No jewels, no money, only paper, baptismal extracts, transfer notes, handwritten corrections matching no public registry, and one repeated phrase written in different hands across decades. Do not reconcile. The documents confirmed what had only been suspected, that certain identities were never meant to be aligned with origin. That reunification itself was considered a threat. The box was quietly removed. Within weeks, the seminary changed ownership. The papers disappeared again, but not before one archivist photographed several pages. Those images still circulate, never authenticated, never disproven. They exist in a space the city prefers not to acknowledge. People ask why no one came forward. The answer is simple and terrifying. Confession would not have punished individuals. It would have exposed a structure, adoption systems, church authority, property inheritance, racial classification itself. To confess was to unravel legitimacy. So instead, guilt was diffused, shared, diluted across generations until no single person felt responsible. The silence was not enforced by threat. It was protected by benefit. Even today, some families avoid DNA testing, not out of fear, but instinct, because results raise questions that no elder can answer without opening sealed rooms in the past. Therapists describe patients with inexplicable grief tied to ancestry, a sense of being placed rather than born, a lineage that feels curated. The language has changed. The sensation has not. When trauma is organized, it becomes inheritance. The horror is not miscegenation. It is not passing. It is choice without consent. A system that decided who could belong where, then convinced itself it was merciful. The city did not merely hide the truth. It sold it, baptized it, educated it, and seated it at tables built on absence. That is the nightmare. Those cribs were not symbols. They were transactions. And while the wood rotted and the buildings fell, the consequences walked forward, wearing borrowed names. Somewhere in New Orleans, there are still families who do not know why certain photos feel wrong. Why certain heirlooms carry weight without memory. Because the white cribs were never empty. They were waiting.